Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to AJ 101 Criminal Law Online. And tonight's lecture, we are going to be going over Chapter 15, which encompasses robbery and extortion. And not only are we going to take a detailed look at each one of these two separate crimes, but as we get towards the end, we're going to kind of compare and contrast them so you can see the differences between the two. And there really are some differences that I think are important for us to point out, especially if you're investigating cases that might seem similar and you're trying to figure out, hey, what kind of crime do I have? Do I have a robbery, or do I have some type of extortion? So when you talk about the definition of robbery, we'll start with Penal Code 211. So robbery is the felonious taking of personal property in the possession of another from his, and when they say his in here, remember the language they use, it could be his or hers, it doesn't make a difference, from his personal or immediate presence and against his will, accomplished by means of force or fear. Now, robbery is distinguished from theft, regular theft, as a crime against person due to the danger of using force or fear. Burglary and theft and things like that, those are considered to be property crimes, and robbery is considered to be a crime against person. So that's kind of the distinction there. So before we kind of look at some of the elements of robbery, I think it's important that we look at a couple other things that really are important to, specific to robbery, if you will. So at common law, robbery was a felony crime against both the person and the property of another. Well, then, as it is today, robbery amounted to the taking of the personal property of another from the victim's personal or immediate presence by violence or intimidation, and of course against the victim's will. Now, we just kind of talked about it. Robbery is distinguished from theft in that theft or larceny is an offense against property, and robbery is classified as a crime against persons in the penal code because of the grave danger which a robbery victim can be subjected to. Now, in robbery, it is necessary that the taking be with some type of force or fear against the victim's will and from the person or the immediate presence of the victim. The vast majority of robberies are, in fact, committed by armed suspects between ages of 16 and 25 years, many of whom are drug users who need to support their habit. Now, when you talk about the elements of robbery, when we look at the section, and we can go back, but let's just kind of move forward, robbery includes as a necessary element the specific intent to deprive the owner of his or her property. And the crime must also include that word that we talked about in a different chapter called asportation. And what does that mean? Hopefully you remember. That means like movement or carrying away. So the perpetrator or the suspect must have actually taken or acquired dominion or control, if you will, over the property of the victim before the crime is complete. In other words, a theft must have occurred. Now, the corpus delicti of robbery may be proven by circumstantial evidence, thus where the victim is assaulted and rendered unconscious and awakes with his property missing, it may be properly inferred that the elements of robbery have been met. And there's a case on that, People versus Huber, if you want to look at it a little bit further. So just really quick, the essential elements or corpus delicti of robbery: taking of personal property of some value from the possession of another, the asportation, from the person or immediate presence of the victim against the victim's will, of course without consent, accomplished by means of force or fear, violence or threatened violence, and with the intent to permanently deprive the owner of possession or withhold possession for so long of a time to actually diminish the value to the owner. So let's come back now and let's kind of rehash a couple of things and get more into it. So robbery requires the specific intent to deprive an owner of his or her property. Now, the taking of property in robbery includes two things. One would be this word called caption, which means gaining possession, and the other should be a familiar word that you should be getting used to by now, which is asportation, and that means carrying away or movement of property or something similar. Now, the taking must be accomplished again by the use of force or fear, and without asportation, the crime of robbery is not complete. Now, there was a case called People versus Quinn, and this is where the California courts have held that forcing someone to throw property, and in this example, their wallet on the ground, is considered asportation even if the suspect fails to pick it up. So that victim apparently relinquished their property, and throwing it on the ground was enough to show the asportation in that particular case. So again, remember, when we look at sections and codes like this, we have to go back and really look at the different definitions that are in there. Like, what does taking mean? And what does immediate presence mean? So we kind of went over it already, but just to quickly review, the taking of the property includes those two aspects that I just spoke of, which is caption, which refers to getting possession, and asportation, which means carrying away. Well, now we're going to talk about, hey, that immediate presence. Well, what does that mean? Because the code talks about from the person or immediate presence. Well, in robbery, the taking must be either from the owner's person or his or her immediate presence. Now, the term immediate presence provides some flexibility to the word presence or the definition of that. So an example, tying an owner in one room and taking the money from a safe in another constitutes immediate presence. So there's a couple of different case laws that give some different variations, but when you talk about immediate presence, we have a little bit of flexibility. Now, robbery committed within the hearing or perception of the victim who is being restrained nearby is also considered to be immediate presence. So now let's look at against the victim's will. So we're just kind of going down the line. We've got the taking, we talked about the from the person or immediate presence, and now let's look at against the victim's will. The element of consent is truly lacking in the crime of robbery, and thus distinguishes it from the crime of extortion, which we're going to talk about later, which is defined further as obtaining property from another with consent. And I know that sounds confusing, but we'll get back to that. Generally, the crime of extortion, or in the crime of extortion, there is also the element of choice, but such is not the case in robbery. Okay, so the element of consent, again, is lacking in the crime of robbery, and that's what distinguishes robbery from extortion, and we'll compare those towards the end of the lecture. Now, when the victim is unaware of the taking of the property by reason of the suspect, an example would be like being struck and that person becomes unconscious and somebody takes their property, it is still considered to be robbery. In cases where absence of will is brought on by the victim, being voluntary intoxication, and property is taken off of the victim's body or immediate presence, it's not considered robbery, but it's considered more grand theft or petty theft, of course, depending upon the value of whatever it is that's been taken from the victim. And then now let's look at fear. What does fear mean, and how do we define it? So again, we're kind of walking through. We've done the taking, we've done the from the person and immediate presence, we've done the against the victim's will, and now let's look at this kind of fear thing. So fear is defined in Penal Code 212, and the fear of an unlawful injury to the person or property of the person robbed or any relative or member of his or her family. The fear of an immediate and unlawful injury to the person or property of anyone in the company of the person robbed at the time of the robbery. So this is the definition of fear. So you can see that if this fear is present during the taking of that particular property, then it does qualify as an actual robbery. So now let's look at force and fear. Some violence, fear, or intimidation must be used in the taking of property by robbery, or the crime is theft. So you have to have some level of that. Thefts from a person, like pickpocketing, is not a robbery unless sufficient force or fear can be proven. Now, the threat of violence also must be such as to create a reasonable apprehension of danger. If a person forcibly takes property under a good faith claim, even if they're mistaken, it can be a defense to a robbery charge. And then once an act of asportation has occurred, the crime is complete, even if the property is returned. So again, in review, some violence, fear, or intimidation must be used in the taking of property by robbery, or the crime is merely theft. And we talked about the example of the pickpocket. Well, a little bit more to add to this. So whenever there's a struggle by the victim to keep his or her property, or if it is detached by force, as for instance, say a purse strap that's broken during a purse snatch, or what we kind of call a strong arm robbery, there is sufficient evidence, okay, or sufficient force to constitute robbery. And what begins as a petty theft or grand theft may also become a robbery if the thief resorts to force or fear in order to retain possession or make good his escape. Now, there's a case out there, People versus Estes. It's E-S-T-E-S. This kind of case is known as an Estes robbery based on that case, where a thief initially takes property by stealth, but shoots at the victim to prevent capture or recovery. And the courts had ruled in that particular case that the crime of robbery was ultimately committed. Intimidation or putting in fear will supply the requisite fear in the commission of robbery. It must be remembered, however, that the crime does not require both force and fear, but force or fear. Thus, one element may operate independently from the other. And then, before we talk about degrees, and we're making actually pretty good time here, I wanted to throw in some information on intent, because we've talked about intent in a lot of different crimes. To constitute any theft offense, including robbery, the suspect must have the specific intent to deprive the owner of the property either permanently or for a substantial time as to diminish the value to the owner. And that's a case, People versus Avery. And you don't have to know that, but I just wanted to kind of make sure that I threw that out there. So how many degrees of robbery are there? Well, we talked about burglary, where there's a couple of degrees, and we've talked about murder, where there's a couple of degrees. So there are a couple of degrees of robbery as well. So Penal Code 212.5 shows how robbery is divided into 2 degrees, and it's first degree or second degree. Now, robbery in the first degree is robbery of a bus, a streetcar, a taxi cab driver, etc., or the passenger in any of those vehicles. Robbery that's carried out in an inhabited dwelling is first degree robbery. And then also a robbery during the use of or after using an ATM machine is a first degree robbery. All other robberies that are not stated above that I just talked about are considered to be second degree. And then, just like a lot of other crimes, we have attempted robbery. And when the intent to commit robbery is evident and the robber has taken an act toward the act, he or she can be convicted of attempted robbery. Now, mere preparation, just getting ready for your robbery or whatever, is not enough to meet the attempted robbery requirements. So what needs to happen is the assailant or the suspect or the suspects must be dangerously close to completing the crime or in its final commencement in order for it to be attempt robbery. But so when people rob people, does it matter about value and who owns it in order to be a victim? So let's say that I'm carrying in my pocket your iPhone, and somebody comes up and robs me at gunpoint. They point a gun at me and demand my phone, but it's not my phone, it's your phone. So first of all, I'll just give it to them because it's your phone. No, I'm kidding. But I mean, so who's the victim there? And does there have to be an amount, a dollar amount, in order for robbery to kind of come into play? Well, in robbery, the amount and value of an item of personal property is pretty much immaterial. The value of property need only be slight. Now, they don't put a dollar amount on it, but it has to be some kind of value of something. Now, the property does have to have, again, some legal value, and the person being robbed doesn't have to be the owner of the property to be a victim of robbery. So when robbers confront several people during a robbery, during one incident, you can also basically charge or initiate a separate charge of robbery for each individual person that was there. So hopefully that kind of makes sense as well. So there are a couple of other robbery sections that are listed on page 240, and I think even 241, but probably just 240, where we've got some miscellaneous sections as it relates to robbery with some increased penalties. And yes, there still is a section for train robbery, and there's a section for carjacking, and we'll look at that as well. So if somebody were to rob you of your vehicle, it has its own section. There's a section for inflicting great bodily injury as well, along with being armed with a firearm or deadly weapon or using a firearm. So we're going to talk about carjacking in a second, but I want to kind of show you the enhancements or the increased penalties. So we'll go down to use of a firearm. So we're going to look at section 12022.53 of the Penal Code. Now, personal use of a firearm during a robbery or during other specified felonies, and there's a list of them, adds a mandatory consecutive term of 10 years of imprisonment. Personal discharge of a firearm during the robbery requires a consecutive 20-year term, and if great bodily injury results other than to an accomplice, an enhancement of 25 years to life applies. So you have to kind of think about this. Could that be why when you have individuals that go into, whether they're banks or other stores, they might use a note that says, this is a robbery, I have a bomb, or something like that, and they don't use a firearm, or they think that, or they use a replica firearm. So the reason is because you can tell by reading the code here that the additional penalties, the increased penalties are very severe when you use a firearm to commit a robbery. So you can definitely tell that. So what's the difference now as we start talking about, robbing somebody of their vehicle? And again, I guess before I get started, there was one other thing that I failed to mention, and it just kind of popped into my brain as I was talking. A lot of times, and that's the reason that we really read the codes and things, because the average person, when they call up dispatch, those of you that work communications, you know this, but when somebody calls up, if their house was burglarized, typically they'll call in and say they've been robbed. And that's why it's good to understand the difference between, burglary and robbery, which is why we're really going over a lot of these things, not just for the sake of you learning, but to understand the different elements of each crime. So typically when people call in and say I've been robbed, they've actually been the victim of theft or burglary. But that's enough of that. Let's go back to robbery versus carjacking. So why is carjacking a different crime than robbery? Well, robbery in itself requires the specific intent to permanently deprive the owner of his or her property by force or fear. Now, carjacking, on the other hand, requires the taking of a motor vehicle intending to permanently or temporarily deprive the victim by force or fear. So there's a little bit of difference in there. And that's one of the reasons why it has its actual own section. So when we talk about carjacking, which is Penal Code 215, you can see the difference, the comparison between robbery and carjacking. However, carjacking has the same maximum penalty as first-degree robbery, which is 9 years in the state prison. So what is the punishment for robbery? Well, robbery of the first degree, and we know what that constitutes, is punishable by imprisonment in the state prison for 3, 4, or 6 years. However, if the robbery is committed by 3 or more persons in concert, meaning acting together, punishment could be 3, 6, or 9 years. Robbery of the second degree is punishable by imprisonment in the state prison for 2, 3, or 5 years. Now, notwithstanding Penal Code 664, which is the punishment for attempted robbery is punishable by imprisonment in the state prison. So, and remember, these are the base charges or the base punishments, the amount of time, but there can be enhancements depending upon the circumstances of the case. So I think we kind of know that. So now that we've talked about robbery and we've defined it and we've looked at different sections and we know the difference between carjacking and robbery and things like that, let's move a little bit towards extortion and talk about extortion for a little bit. Well, extortion can be defined under Penal Code 518, and it is the obtaining of property from another with his consent or her consent, or obtaining an official act of a public officer induced by a wrongful use of force or fear, or under color of official right. And I know that sounds very legalese, but we're going to kind of go through it and discuss a little bit. So the crime of extortion, which is frequently referred to as blackmail, and you've probably heard that before, is closely related to robbery in many aspects, and we'll look at a chart in just a few minutes. The essence of the offense of extortion is that it results in unlawfully obtaining something of value by wrongfully using force or fear. Okay, and we'll dig deeper. This statute covers the crime of obtaining money or property from another with the victim's consent. Now, the victim's consent, of course, is obtained by using force or fear. And the origin of the term blackmail has an interesting history. Wealthy knights of old wore gilded armor with fancy chainmail, and poor knights wore black armor with plain mail. It was the custom that any knight knocked off of his horse in a tournament lost his horse to the opponent. Now, a few especially crafty jousters donned black armor, unhorsed the richest knights, and sold the prize horses back to the knights who lost them. The scam became so common it was given a name only later to mean something else, and that name was blackmail. And I bet you didn't know that. That's actually pretty cool. So let's kind of revisit this and then move on and look at the elements. Obtaining property of another with somebody's consent, kind of interesting, or obtaining an official act of a public officer induced by a wrongful use of force or fear, or under color of official right. So a little bit of discussion. The crime of extortion, frequently called blackmail, we know is close to robbery in some aspects. However, extortion results in the unlawful obtaining of something of value by wrongfully using force or fear. And the statute covers the crime of obtaining property with the victim's consent. And consent is, of course, can be a response to the suspect's threat, usually to expose that person, that victim, to something that he or she doesn't want anybody else to know, which again is kind of interesting. So some of the elements there when we talk about it, consent, force, and fear. So consent in extortion is more in the nature of choice. So an example would be, hey, give up your property or suffer the consequences of being exposed. If you don't do A, I'm going to expose you about B. So that's where the consent kind of rolls in. And the element of force or fear may be accomplished by one of the threats below, including to do an unlawful injury to the person or property of the individual threatened or a third person, to accuse the individual threatened or any relative of his or her family of any crime, or to expose or impute him or them any deformity, disgrace, or crime. And here's one that really is, that's always kind of out there: to expose any secret affecting him or her, like maybe somebody's having an affair or something like that. Does that make sense? And then there's another one that's added in your textbook, and it's not here on the slides, and it's to report his or her immigration status or suspected immigration status. So can you see how extortion might fit there? Hey, you know what? I know you're not in this country legally, so if you don't do this or pay me this or whatever, I'm going to expose your secret about your immigration status. That is, in essence, extortion. When we talk about threat, because again, we're going down through the elements here, a threat to do bodily harm to others or to inflict property damage meets the legal requirement of extortion. Now, the threat of exposure, or this game they call the Badger game, is a type of extortion trick. So the badger game is a type of trick usually in the form of enticing a man, and sorry guys, because it's usually us because we're like just dumb, but anyway, enticing a man into a compromising position with a woman whose real or pretended husband comes upon the scene and demands payment or something else under the threat of prosecution or exposure. Now, such a threat is sufficient under this section to constitute the crime of extortion within the meaning of Penal Code Section 519. So the example here, again, you can see enticing a person, and it doesn't have to be a man, but typically, guys, sorry, typically it's us. It can be a female, so I guess gender really doesn't play a role, but the way that this thing was initially brought up and people used to use it was targeting males versus females. So can you have an attempted extortion? And that's found in Penal Code Section 524. So every person who attempts by means of any threat, such as specified in Penal Code 519, to extort money or other property from another is guilty of a felony wobbler. So to kind of discuss it a little bit further, one is guilty of the crime of attempted extortion when his or her acts are ineffectual in bringing about the contemplated results or result of extorting money or property from the intended victim. Does that kind of make sense to everybody? So to commit the offense of attempted extortion, there must be a specific intent to commit the crime and a direct but ineffectual act. And then a couple other really quick things of note. There are different, not just categories of extortion, like threat of exposure or obtaining a signature that we're going to talk about, or sending letters with the intent to extort. So there's a couple of other different sections that we're going to hit before we look at this final chart. So every person who by extraordinate means obtains from another his signature to any paper or instrument whereby if such signature were freely given and property would be transferred or any debt, demand, charge, or right of action created is punishable in the same manner as if the actual delivery of such debt, demand, charge, or right of action were obtained. So Penal Code 522. So that covers obtaining a signature by threats. And then, you know, some movies that we've seen and things like that, we've seen threatening letters that get sent to people where the letters are cut out of magazines and they're glued or, you know, or taped on the letter. And typically sending a threatening letter with intent to extort is in fact a crime if you look at Penal Code Section 523. So every person who with the intent to extort any money or other property from another sends or delivers to any person any letter or other writing, whether signed or not, expressing or implying, or adapted to imply any threat, such as specified in Penal Code 519, is punishable in the same manner as if such money or property were actually obtained by the means of such threat. So yes, that definitely is something that can take place. So what's the penalty for extortion? Well, they list the penalties in a couple of different sections. Penal Code Section 520, 521, and Section 524. So now what we've put together here for you is a very easy chart, if you will, to compare and contrast what 211 PC robbery is and Penal Code Section 518 extortion is. So you can look at these side by side and you can look at the actual definition and the elements that are needed, and then the fear factor portion down below. So let's look at robbery on the left first. Taking the property of another. Now you go to the right, extortion. Obtaining, need not actually take. So you can already see some difference. From the victim's person or immediate presence. On the other side, personal property of another or an official act by a public officer. Go down on robbery side, against the victim's will. Go on the other side, with the victim's consent. So note the difference between the two. Yes, we know on the extortion side the consent is given because it's induced by a wrongful use of force, but we're just looking line by line on the section. Number 4 on the robbery side, by means of force or fear. Number 4 on the extortion side, induced by wrongful use of force. That threat of exposure. And then number 5 on this side, on the robbery side, with intent to deprive or devaluate. Now, if you look at the fear in robbery versus extortion, robbery, threat of immediate unlawful injury to victim's person, property, relative. Extortion, threat of future unlawful injury, person, property, relatives, any third person. So I hope this chart kind of helps you out as you look at the two side by side. Now, they also have put together kind of the same thing that's a little bit more difficult to read. So this one, I'm not really sure why the publisher put it in there, because honestly, this one is a little more simplistic to look at. But this is a good way to put these side by side and note the difference between the two. There's also the same diagram or chart, if you will, on page 243 in your textbook, and I know that you're totally looking at it right now as we're talking about this, because that's the kind of students that you are. You are just so truly so diligent. But anyway, it's there for you to use. So that's going to be the end of our chapter 15 lecture on robbery and extortion. And as always, don't forget to look at the student resources that are at the end of each chapter. Again, they're just a really good way to help you study. And I know I'm really pushing those on you because it really, really does help. And also, as usual, if you have any questions, feel free to post those on the general discussion board. If you don't want to do it there, you can email me and I will get back to you as soon as possible. So with that being said, that's going to be it for this evening, and until next time.